Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is the third hearing on the national security implications of climate change that I've attended since this Congress began. It was the topic of the Select Committee's first ever hearing in April 2007, as well as a hearing in the Science Committee last September. Reading through the testimony, it doesn't seem like there's much new information to assess. Much of the information today is based on last year's UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. The conclusions of the IPCC have been studied in great detail by this Congress and warrant further consideration in the next Congress. However, I think the American people want the Congress today to focus on how to reduce gas and energy prices, improve energy security, and to increase domestic energy supplies. The National Intelligence Estimate appears to give a good overview of climate change projections, how they might affect certain regions and nations, and how this will affect the United States. The NIA constructs these projections out to 2030, which is a far shorter time frame than many of the projections in the IPCC report. Much of the worst-case scenarios projected by the IPCC are in the latter half of this century. The national security implications of climate change will cause some concerns, but so do the implications of climate change policies that stand to reduce the availability of cheap, reliable energy sources around the world. Many of the cases detailed in the NIA will have to be dealt with through adaptive measures. As one of our witnesses will point out today, much of the world is not only poor, but energy poor, which makes adaptation much more difficult. The testimony of Marlo Lewis, Senior Fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, shows that an estimated 1.6 billion people have no access to electricity at all. Power plants, however fueled, would immeasurably improve these people's lives. Where do they fit into the climate change picture? The testimony of Lee Lane, Resident Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, summarizes the complexity of this issue. Mr. Lane notes that the lens of national security might not be the best way to view the issues associated with global warming. Climate change policy will require trade-offs that are unavoidable, including a weakened U.S. economy that could affect how this country handles conflicts. And Mr. Lane notes that if China and India do not participate in efforts to cut greenhouse gases, worldwide efforts to reduce carbon dioxide concentrations will fail. I agree. Dr. Finger, am I correct in assuming that the National Intelligence Estimate was based exclusively on the report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change?
No, sir. You're not correct in that.
Okay.
We took as a starting point the IPCC fourth report. We added to that peer-reviewed scientific materials produced in the years since that report was produced. We consulted with a variety of U.S. government and academic specialists on it. But we did not attempt to evaluate the climate science. That review and supplementing of it said that reflected a reasonable scientific projection. The IPCC report is at a global level, which doesn't provide very much useful information on how individual nations, subcomponents of nations, sectors of the economy, agricultural crops, and so forth. For that kind of detail, we turn to the two commissioned studies.
Several weeks ago, there was an article that appeared in Nature magazine that said for approximately the next decade, we will be experiencing a period of global cooling. Was any of the information in the Nature article put into the National Intelligence Assessment, or did that article come out too late for it to be of use to you?
Other than the experts that we consulted may have seen it and factored it into their analysis, but we did not use it.
Well, given the fact that the computerized projections that the IPCC used would come up with a significantly different result if even there was a 1/10 of a degree cooling or a 1/10 of a degree warming, and greater than that if the variations were different either up or down. How would the national intelligence estimate or national intelligence assessment change if the IPCC projections ended up being proven wrong because of changes in actual observed temperatures, either upwards or downwards?
We can't answer that question, sir.
Okay.
Because we took as the starting point projected change. If change occurs in ways that are different than our assessments based on the projection of the individual countries and then a projection of the coping capacity of those countries and then on national security, would have to change. But again, the starting point for this was the climate science report.
As you may know, I have somewhat of a skeptical view of this entire issue, and I am deeply concerned about the impacts on the economies and on the people of some of the changes that have been proposed. You may recall that sometime this winter the European Commission reduced the cap on carbon emissions for EU countries, including the United Kingdom. And shortly thereafter, the Times of London ran a story that said that this would cost the British electric generating industry approximately 6 billion British pounds or 12 billion US dollars per year in order to buy the carbon offset credits necessary. And of course, all of this would end up being passed on to ratepayers and consumers of electricity. Furthermore, this story indicated that about 2/3 of the credits would be purchased outside the European Union. This is not a free lunch, and I am wondering what the British government is proposing to help residential ratepayers, particularly those on fixed incomes, who pay for this huge...
Share your concern if it was believed that in the round there would be a very damaging and only a damaging economic impact. And you picked up quite rightly on the increase in energy costs. The British government already does give extra help, particularly to the least well-off, the elderly, to the most vulnerable, and is looking all the time at how much more can be done and when it can be done. But I think I would stress that although for those who, like me, are believers in the science, it would be much more difficult if we believed that the net impact, the overall impact, would just be damaging. But we, many of us, believe that in fact, if you look at the position in the round, there are advantages as well as disadvantages. Let me give you a specific example. It's now very much predicted that ice in the Arctic will disappear faster than anyone had imagined. That can cause problems, but also, of course, it could create new trade passages. It could free up the availability of greater resources. And one of the challenges for the world community is to try to see that the availability, for example, of those trade routes, of those resources, doesn't feed conflict and instability by trying to encourage international cooperation. So yes, of course, there will be some damaging impacts, but there are huge opportunities too, not least for those who are the first movers in the industries, in the technological developments that will be required.
About 6 billion pounds of higher electricity costs in a country the size of the United Kingdom is a lot of money, and it's going to impact people who are the least likely to pay the most. If all of a sudden next month's electricity bill will be 2 or 3 times their current electricity bill. Is the government prepared to have a welfare program that is that vast in order to prevent people like this from frankly going broke or freezing during the winter?
Well, as I said, Mr. Sensenbrenner, the government does in fact have such a program, although I no longer speak for the government. But can I add that yes, there is an impact on the cost of the electricity companies. Those same companies have made similarly large sums of money over the last few years in terms of extra profits, and there is much discussion about how they can work with the government to help those who are most vulnerable. So that is constantly kept under review, and that will always be the case in every country. I assure you, I am as conscious of the need to get re-elected as any politician. So yes, of course, we recognise these impacts, but there is another side to the coin which is not always recognised.
Thank you.